1977, commonly known as the year the world witnessed the explosion of punk. The UK had the Sex Pistols and the US had the Ramones. Never mind the bollocks, here's the Sex Pistols became the golden standard for punk. The Ramones, however, had already released their debut record on April the 23rd, 1976. And of course, there were dozens of other punk outfits that sprang to life during this era. Bad Brains, Discharge, the Buzzcocks, UK Subs, and Dead Boys, to name a few. Whilst punk was generally influenced by aggression and a hatred for the establishment, there was a ghoulish version of this genre cooking up in New Jersey, 1977. Fueled by horror movies, the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe, and a jawline sharper than a butcher's knife. This would be a very unique version of punk. Their logo and imagery is instantly recognizable and has become ever synonymous with Halloween and all things spooky. This is a group that would combine horror and punk in such an interesting way that they became legends in their own right. This is We Are 138, the story of the Misfits. Bands that call themselves punk these days aren't punk. It's someone's idea of punk, but it's not punk.
I would say vocally, Elvis, Jim Morrison, Bill Medley, which is a big shock to a lot of people.
Of the Righteous Brothers, yeah.
Great singer, and Roy Orbison.
Glenn Danzig, born June 1955 in Lodi, New Jersey. Born to a Protestant father who became a Marine serving in World War II and the Korean conflict, and his mother a Catholic. Glenn had 3 brothers, and his mother would play records by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. His 2 older brothers also amassed a large record collection that he would often explore. He would discover Roy Orbison, Righteous Brothers, and even Bob Dylan. I wasn't a nice kid, but I wasn't the worst kid. The worst kids I knew are now dead or in jail. I could have been one of them if I'd made the wrong decision. I ended up on that road on a number of occasions and had to steer myself back. I definitely believe in a yin and yang, good and evil. My religion is a patchwork of whatever is real to me. If I can draw the strength to get through the day from something, that's religion. Danzig caught a taste for live music early on as he essentially became a roadie for his older brothers who were playing in a local band. Glenn himself would soon join a covers band on vocals. The group would be given the name of 𝐕Get and 𝕣Get by Glenn himself. And yes, I have no idea what that means either. Nonetheless, they would cover Chuck Berry, Led Zeppelin, Free, and other classics from this era. It's also worth noting that Danzig actually took piano and clarinet lessons during his formative years. An image I really cannot picture, no matter how hard I try. But it would be his love for Elvis that inspired him the most. I've always been open about my influences. It all goes back to Elvis. Anytime someone mentions my name and Elvis's name in the same sentence, that's great. It doesn't get better than that. Obviously, when I was younger, everybody knew who Elvis was. I got into Elvis because I hated going to school. So I would play hooky a lot or cut school, and I'd stay home and watch old movies. I remember one day watching Jailhouse Rock and just going, whoa. By the end of the movie, I was like, this guy's cool, this is what I want to do. Jailhouse Rock is without doubt one of the most well-known Elvis songs, and it comes from the 1957 film of the same name, starring, you guessed it, Elvis Presley. Elvis would also be one of the main inspirations for Glenn's vocal style. I don't have that screechy, high metal voice, so I gravitated more to that kind of vocal style, like bluesier stuff. I've been pretty vocal about my influences, like Elvis or Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, Willie Dixon, things like that. Yeah, the deeper voice always works for me better. And if you're not familiar with Howlin' Wolf or Muddy Waters, here they are.
Leave me by my hand, then the world will know.
Rock and roll back then was seen as rebellious, with some even accusing Elvis of making the devil's music, which seems incredibly excessive now, but that's just how it was. And Danzig fit that rebellious nature. Not only would he skip school, he somehow ended up using drugs at the age of 10 years old, though he stopped by the age of 15. Danzig definitely had the stereotypical punk spirit though. By the age of 11, he had already been arrested. Me and my friends always got in a lot of trouble. We used to build forts, but then anyone who came by, we would attack and tie them up. We were always getting into trouble for tons of other stuff. Like when I was about 11, I got arrested for breaking and entering this department store. I've been talking to people and talking about getting into trouble when we were kids, and everyone was like, no, I never did that. So I'm thinking that maybe I'm more fucked up than I thought I was. Danzig also became obsessed with comic books from an early age. Whilst Batman, Spider-Man, and Captain America would be the usual obsessions for a young boy, Glenn would tend to identify more towards the villains or anti-heroes, such as Magneto and Submariner being some of his favorites. Glenn even submitted some of his artwork to Marvel Comics, but sadly didn't hear anything back. But of course, we can't forget the biggest influence here when it comes to the overall development of the Misfits concept, and that is Danzig's ever-present love for all things spooky, anything from poetry to horror films. Growing up, while everyone else was reading stupid shit, I was reading Edgar Allan Poe and Baudelaire. I loved horror movies, and I really liked underground comics. At some point, I discovered comics from Italy and Japan, none of this spandex superhero crap. There was this one older horror movie, Plan 9 from Outer Space. You see it now and might think it's pretty bad, but as a child, man, the monsters got me. Plan 9 from Outer Space, released in 1957, was a black and white horror film that featured the character of Vampira, an iconic 1950s macabre creation that first saw the light of day through actress Mayla Numi in the Vampira show.
A vampire cocktail. You like it? It hates you.
Another personal favorite of Danzig's would be the 1972 comedy slasher horror, The Gorgor Girls. And I guess we can't forget Night of the Living Dead from 1968. After all, the Misfits would release a song about it in 1979. The film would also be the inspiration behind the band name. The Misfits, released in 1961, would be Marilyn Monroe's final film to be published before her tragic death a year later. These early obsessions with things that go bump in the night would all lead to the formation of the greatest horror punk band of all time, the Misfits. My hatred of everything. When we started, we hated disco and FM arena rock shit by those terrible 70s bands so much. Journey and Foreigner and all that crap. Corporate bullshit shoved down people's throats. I started putting people together and playing in New Jersey and New York. Max's Kansas City was a good spot to play in New York. This is CBGB's, arguably one of the most important live music venues in the history of music. The Misfits would play their first show here on April the 18th, 1977, and legend has it that Danzig booked this show before he even knew who would be in the band. There was also a solar eclipse on this day. However, whether Danzig knew this and intentionally booked this date because of that is not known, but it's kind of cool. The first ever Misfits show was on the same day as a solar eclipse. And I'd like to think Danzig did do this on purpose. I mean, at the beginning, there weren't any other bands like the Misfits. We were angrier, we were faster, we were louder. We didn't dress the same and people were taken aback by us at first. particularly when we were smashing shit up at our shows. To be honest, we didn't really know that there were other bands like us until we went to check out a band who wanted to play our big Halloween show at Irving Plaza, and Bad Brains were opening for us. We were like, wow. It was only then that we realized there were other bands around the country playing hard and fast. CBGB's, or Country Bluegrass Blues, was the ultimate punk rock bar. Opened in 1973, it became home to the Ramones, Dead Boys, The Cramps, 𝕣Get, and even Blondie before she took off and got big. And it was essentially a shithole. That's how most people would describe it. But it became one of the most iconic venues ever. Now, the Misfits had a fair few lineup changes, and I'm not going to focus on every single member. The main characters throughout the Misfits story usually focus around Glenn Danzig, Jerry Only, Doyle, and Michael Graves, who would replace Danzig on vocals for a brief time. Cough Cool would be the first single to be released by the Misfits in 1977. It was a 7-inch, limited to just 500 copies. And the artwork doesn't really have a Misfits vibe to it. There's no classic Misfits logo or Skullface on the cover. Their second single, Bullet, would feature a more recognizable Misfits logo, but still no Skullface. You will, however, most likely notice the artwork and song is based on the assassination of JFK. The JFK assassination is one of the most widely covered events in US history. Lee Harvey Oswald was famously arrested for his treachery against the American government, but dozens of conspiracy theories have run wild about what really happened ever since. Nevertheless, it was a pretty ballsy piece of artwork for the Misfits to release at this time. But it did seem that Danzig had somewhat of an obsession, or at least a strong interest in conspiracy theories and the darker side of popular culture.
You can learn a lot from this one.
Represented by a song Danzig released in 1981 called Who Killed Marilyn? Marilyn Monroe died of an overdose on August 4th, 1962, at the age of 36. And whilst the press were inclined to say she took her own life, others suggested she was murdered. But let's get back to the spooky stuff. Their 1979 single, Night of the Living Dead, based on the horror film of the same title, would feature their iconic skull mascot on the inner artwork. It wouldn't be until their third single, Horror Business, released in the same year, that the Skullface imagery would appear on the front cover of a Misfits release. And I can already hear die-hard Misfits fans screaming at their screens every time I call it Skullface, so I'll explain exactly what this imagery is and the proper name for it now. This is called the Crimson Ghost. Jerry Only and Danzig essentially took this from the 1946 American film of the same name, and it has become kind of their mascot ever since, and this is the face you now see plastered all over Misfits merchandise, though it would come to be known as the Fiend Skull to Misfits fans. This is what most Misfits fans would call the classic era. They would record their first 4 studio albums during this time period, between 1977 and 1983, but they would only initially release 2 of them. Static Age, released in 1996, would actually be recorded in 1978, technically making it the first Misfits studio album. 12 Hits from Hell would be recorded in 1980 and took years to get an official release, followed by Walk Among Us in 1981 and Earth AD Wolf's Blood in 1983. The studio was on 57th Street in Manhattan. It was called CI Recordings, and a gentleman named David Achilles was the engineer. They gave us about 20 hours of recording time, so we went in having written all the Static Age songs in January 1978. We did Static Age with basically no money and some fucking attitude. It wasn't record company bullshit, it was real. We came up with something and we didn't compromise. Walk Among Us, though, would be the first official debut studio album from the Misfits, with songs such as Vampira and Night of the Living Dead directly referencing influential horror films from Danzig's younger years. In a way, they were kind of like a punk version of Black Sabbath. Doyle, Wolfgang von Frankenstein, and Jerry Only, obviously not their real names, would both appear on the first two officially released Misfits albums. They were both from Lodi, the same as Danzig, and they were brothers. Danzig and Jerry actually taught Doyle how to play guitar. Well, in 1977, I was 13 and my older brother was in a band with Glenn. When I graduated 8th grade, my brother brought me a guitar. Glenn showed me the bar chords and my brother showed me the notes on the A string and the E string, the big strings. And that's all I ever learned. By the time I was 15, I was recording with them. They all went to Lodi High School and Doyle's brother Jerry was on the football team. Here he is posing with other senior players of the team. If you can't figure out which one Jerry is, well, it's the only kid wearing sunglasses. Here's Doyle and then Mr. Danzig himself. Some early influences for Jerry would be the Stooges, Generation X, Lou Reed, and David Bowie. They're one of my favorite punk bands. Billy Idol moved on, and as record companies saw stars rise from the ashes of punk rock, Billy became more pop and new wave. Record labels couldn't handle punk rockers because they couldn't control them. They didn't want to invest money in kids who were a bunch of fuck-ups. Generation X were amazing. It's difficult to know exactly what type of impact the Misfits had very early on. Most punk bands during this time had a pretty small following, and this was long before the advent of the internet and social media.
Alright, and then we got a 7-incher coming out just for Fiend Club members. You can't get it in a record store. Yeah. I'm sure all you guys are gonna get one.
But we do know that they had some pretty die-hard fans, one of them being Henry Rollins.
Trying to sing the fucking songs for you guys, trying to play, and you fucking hit me in the face with a beer can.
Rollins, of course, is famously known for his time in Black Flag, the infamous hardcore punk band from California, originally formed by Keith Morris and Greg Ginn. Here is Henry in 1982, and here he is in 1983. In one of these pictures, you'll not only see he's talking to Doyle, but if you look at his arms, he has not one, but two Crimson Ghost tattoos, or Fiend tattoos. Rollins also ended up on the first Misfits Live record, released in 1982, singing We Are 138. So the Misfits had definitely made a name for themselves by the early 80s. This was the classic Misfits era, and for many, this was the era that delivered some of the absolute greatest Misfits songs. Static Age, Attitude, Astro Zombies, Die, Die, My Darling, Hybrid Moments, Last Caress, and TV Casualty, to name but a few. Also in 1982, the Misfits were hell-bent on proving their love for all things spooky. Whilst on tour, they stopped in New Orleans and decided to hunt down the grave of a very eerie character. Marie Laveau was an occultist and voodoo priestess born in Louisiana in 1801. Legend has it that Marie would practice voodoo rituals under a full moon, and up to 2,000 people would attend these otherworldly ceremonies. Glenn, Doyle, Jerry, and drummer at the time, Robo, went looking for her grave one night and was subsequently arrested for grave robbing and spent the night in jail. They even skipped their court date to continue the tour. It doesn't really get any more punk than that. Sadly though, this was a very short-lived era and the Misfits would officially disband in 1983. As to why, nobody truly knows the exact reason, but a good guess is money. For several years after the band had broken up, Glenn Danzig and Jerry Only were seemingly in competition to see who could instigate the highest number of lawsuits against one another. This was mostly in part to a dispute over royalties and who was allowed to continue to use the Misfits name, amongst a host of other legal disputes. Many years later, Jerry Only would be asked in an interview if he'd kept in touch with Danzig, and this was his response. It depends if lawyers count, but I've always had the greatest respect for the man. We were like brothers that took on the world. The fact that our kingdom went in two different directions didn't mean that we wouldn't reunite. Together, it's an unbeatable team. As we all know though, this was not the end of the ghouls from Lodi, and the Crimson Ghost would soon rise again.
Do you not like talking about the Misfits?
Don't mind. It's
an important part.
It was
part
a
of rock.
starting. You know what? What's really funny is now people like Rolling Stone or Circus, all these people want to talk about that stuff, and I'm like, you should have talked to all of us bands back when it was really important, and you thought it wasn't important, and now you've seen the impact it's had on music, especially bands like us, Bauhaus, tons of bands, Minor Threat, Black Flag. Now they want to talk about it, and you know what? Their business is reporting on music, and they should have did it back then when it was news.
Misfits for now were officially dead. This led to the formation of a new group fronted by Glenn Danzig called Samhain. This was kind of a continuation of the Misfits, and it featured Eerie Von, who was previously a member of the band, and during the 80s, Samhain would release 2 studio albums. Initium, I believe is how it's pronounced, as it's Latin for the beginning, in 1984, and Samhain 3, November Coming Fire, in 1986, with both records being labeled as death rock and horror punk. Danzig, though, would soon branch out on his own with what I guess you could call his solo career, with his new band, cleverly named Danzig. Why not? Danzig would team up with renowned American producer Rick Rubin to release the self-titled debut studio album by Danzig called Danzig in 1988, 5 years after the demise of the Misfits. Fuck. Take a shot every time I say Danzig. Don't do that, you'll fucking die. We'd done a big show and a lot of people from record companies were down trying to sign us. After this wild man comes backstage and he looks like he's out of ZZ Top. It's Rick Rubin. He's raving, "I want to produce you. You've got to let me. I produce Run DMC." I was like, who the fuck is this hippie hip-hop producer? I started working with Rick and we just together decided it was time to change the name. Also, I didn't want to have to change the name again after that. I was already about to start my 3rd band and I wanted that to be it. And Motorhead's Phil Filthy Animal Taylor almost ended up on this record. It was either going to be Chuck Biscuits or Phil Filthy Animal Taylor from Motorhead. I'd been talking to Rick Rubin about overhauling the band and he just said, "Who are your 2 favorite drummers?" When I told him, he just said, "I know both of them." And if you're anything like myself, a massive Motorhead fan, yeah, I'm also wondering what Danzig's debut record would have sounded like with Filthy Taylor behind the kit. Nevertheless, this record would spawn Twist of Cain, Am I Demon, She Rides, and Mother. I'm trying to make some kind of experience for you. It's not just a concert. In fact, it should be some kind of ritual. You should lose your fucking mind for those 2 hours we're on stage. You should go out of your fucking mind. That's really what I'm trying to do. The sing-along, that goes back to early punk rock. It's about everyone being part of it. You know the words? Then sing along with me. You want to scream your head off? Do it, and you can hear it. When we do Mother, for instance, I don't even have to encourage them. I just hold the mic up and they sing along. Between 1988 and 1996, Danzig, the band, would release 5 studio albums, and 1 year later, the Misfits would rise from the ashes to release their 4th studio record, American Psycho. Glenn Danzig, though, was nowhere to be seen. This was the second coming of the Misfits without their leader. In 1995, brothers Jerry Only and Doyle decided to reform the group, but Danzig declined to join them. It seemed the main reason for this was most likely several disputes over royalties and song rights had maybe caused a bit of bad blood. After a legal battle, bassist Jerry Only gained the rights to record and tour under the Misfits name starting in the 1990s, and Danzig went on to find success with his band Danzig. Misfits and Danzig have been active separately for years now. It hasn't been a particularly amicable divide either. The two sides have sued each other multiple times. Michael Graves would be the new singer for the Lodi horror punk outfit, and alongside Jerry and Doyle would see the band release two new albums, American Psycho in 1997 and Famous Monsters in 1999. Arguably the most popular song from this era would be Dig Up Her Bones. Artwork for this single featured an image from The Bride of Frankenstein, taken from the 1935 classic American horror film of the same name. And this would also generate the first official Misfits music video to ever be released commercially. Not only was this the same era that saw the Misfits cover Monster Mash, originally written by Bobby Pickett in 1962, kind of a classic novelty Halloween song now.
I was working in the lab late one night when my...
It was also the first time the Misfits had seen more commercial recognition for their work. Their fourth studio album, American Psycho, would be the first to enter the Billboard chart in the US. It debuted at number 117 on the 31st of May, 1997, and stayed there for 2 weeks. And Famous Monsters would debut at number 138 on the 23rd of October, 1999. This was a great success for the Misfits and also their new singer, Michael Graves. But sadly for Graves, this wouldn't last. The whole Misfits journey started for me when I was 19 years old. I joined the band when I was 20. It was a difficult transition into the world that I knew. All my friends were going to college and having a very, very different life than I had. After I left Misfits, I lost everything. My friends were gone, all my money was gone, I didn't have any contacts in the record industry, I had nowhere to go. It seemed that more internal conflict and ego would cause another split within the spooky camp, and for many fans, this was pretty much the death of the Misfits completely. Jerry would take over on vocals until 2016, when Danzig decided to reunite with the original core members after even more legal disputes had been settled between, you guessed it, Glenn and Jerry. Most people imagine Misfits to be this epic punk band that had a long and successful career that spanned over 40 years, but it was actually very chaotic, fractured, and kind of short-lived in a way when you consider how little time the classic lineup actually spent together since their formation in 1977. However, their name really did stand the test of time, and the iconic imagery of the Misfits is just as important as the music.